The wind screamed through the valley that night, carrying icy needles of snow that struck against the wooden walls of the hut. Inside, a small fire burned low in the stone hearth, its weak glow barely pushing back the dark shadows. Jack sat near the fire with his coat drawn tight across his shoulders. His breath floated in the air, proof that even the inside of the hut could not fully escape the cold hand of the storm. He had been alone for weeks, surviving off dried meat and what little game he could trap in the barren woods. Solitude had become his only companion. The sound of the storm outside was constant and cruel, but he was used to loneliness and hardship. He waited in silence, staring at the flickering flames, listening to the creak of the beams as the wind pressed against the hut. Then something happened. A sudden pounding noise knocked against the door, loud, violent, carried by the storm. Jack startled, unsure if the sound was real or only his imagination shaped by the wind. But the noise came again, sharp, desperate, telling him that someone or something was out there. Cautiously, he rose and unlatched the wooden door against the fierce wind. Snow whipped inside, blinding him for a moment, but then a figure stumbled past the threshold. The person fell hard to the floor, gasping and trembling, the door slamming shut again as the blizzard raged at his back. It was a woman. She was wrapped in what had once been beautiful layers of cloth, though the storm had torn at them and coated them with ice. Her face was pale, lips blue with cold, and her eyes shook with panic. She clutched at the ground, too weak to rise. Jack dropped to his knees beside her, pulling her closer to the fire with firm, steady hands. He wrapped her in a fur blanket that had kept him alive through many winters. He spoke softly, though she could not yet hear his words over the rush of the storm still ringing in her ears. As the warmth of the fire touched her again, she blinked and slowly lifted her gaze. For the first time, she seemed to truly see the man kneeling in front of her. Her eyes widened, and she let out a sharp sound, a gasp filled with fear. Her whole body recoiled away from him. It was as though he were a monster, and not the man who had just carried her from the frozen edge of death. Jack froze at the sight, did not understand. He had offered shelter, yet she looked at him as if she had stepped into danger instead of safety. Her lips trembled as if to speak, but no words came out. She wrapped the fur tighter around herself, hunched low, staring at him with a mix of dread and disbelief. Confused but patient, Jack backed away from her. He sat down on the other side of the fire, leaving space between them so she could feel no trapped. His voice was low and calm, though the wind outside tried to swallow it. He told her she was safe here, that the storm was too strong for travel, and that she would die if she stepped back outside. She did not answer. Her eyes studied him, her breathing uneven, and her hands clenched on the blanket like a soldier holding onto a shield. Her silence stretched long into the night. Jack leaned against the wall, watching her carefully. There was nobility in her face, a strange dignity, even in her weakness. She was not a traveler from the rough villages, nor a wanderer of the frontier. Her clothing was too fine, marked with patterns of silver thread, and a crest unfamiliar to him. It struck him that she was no simple runaway. Whoever she was, she had belonged to a different world than his. The storm outside roared on, but inside the hut, the louder sound was the space between them. One man who had lived too long alone, and one woman caught between terror and survival. Jack knew nothing of her name, nothing of her story, and still nothing of why she looked at him with such alarm. But he also knew this: the storm would bury anyone caught in its arms before morning came. Whether she feared him or not, she could not leave. Quietly, he placed another log on the fire and left her in control of her space. He turned his eyes once more to the flames, while the storm battered the walls of the hut. The night stretched long, heavy with silence, fear, and something else neither of them could yet name. The storm did not end when morning came. Snow pressed against the hut in heavy waves, sealing them deeper into the frozen valley. Jack checked the small window and saw nothing beyond a wall of white swirling endlessly. The world outside was gone, swallowed by ice. Inside, the small fire burned weakly, its crackle the only reminder that warmth still existed. The woman sat near the fire, wrapped tight in the fur blanket he had given her. Her face was pale, but less blue than when she had arrived. She was silent, though he could feel her eyes following him whenever he moved. Her fear of him lingered like a second shadow between them. Jack kept his voice calm as he busied himself with simple tasks. He added wood to the fire, adjusted the pot where snow melted to water, and checked his small sack of food. He spoke gently as if to ease her suspicion. He asked if she could drink water, if her hands still shook, and if she felt the fire's warmth. She hesitated with each answer, but finally she nodded. Her voice was faint when she spoke for the first time. She said her name was Alina. The name struck him as elegant. It matched the fine details of her ruined clothes, the small crest sewn into her torn sleeve. It told him she was not a wanderer. He waited for her to explain more, but she fell silent again, staring into the fire with distant eyes. Hours passed with little sound but the storm, and then she surprised him. She asked who he was. He told her the simple truth. His name was Jack. He said this hut had been his for years, built with his own hands when he left the crowded towns behind. He confessed that he lived alone in the wilderness now, hunting and trapping, sometimes trading when the weather allowed. His life was simple and harsh, not a life of glory. She listened closely, though her expression stayed guarded. When he finished, she asked why he would remain in such emptiness. Jack shrugged. He told her that silence was easier than betrayal, and solitude was safer than broken trust. He did not say more, though his words carried a quiet weight. For the first time, he saw the sharp edge of sympathy in her eyes. It flickered, faint but real, yet still her fear remained. She asked softly if he meant her harm. Jack almost laughed, but the question was too painful for laughter. He shook his head and said life in the wilderness was hard enough without cruelty. To choose to harm another would only mean choosing more misery, and he had no room left for that. The fire snapped in the hearth while his words settled. Slowly, though not fully, her shoulders untensed. She sipped from the warm cup of water he offered. His rough hands still made her wary. The quiet in his tone was unlike the brutal figure she had expected when she first opened her eyes in his hut. That night, as the storm pressed against the walls, she began to whisper more pieces of her story. She came from a distant city beyond the mountains, where wealth and ceremony bound her days. She was not only a woman of noble house, but the queen of fractured lands in the west. Her caravan had been caught in the storm, her guards scattered, her horses lost. Left alone in the blinding snow, she had stumbled until her strength gave out, finding the hut by chance. Jack listened in silence, understanding at last why fear had burned so brightly in her eyes when she looked at him. Tales traveled far, and the courts whispered of men like him as savages of the fringe. That was what she had been told to believe. Yet the warmth of the fire and the steadiness of his presence did not fit those tales. She spoke more than before, her voice soft but steadying, and he answered only when she wished him to. By the time the night deepened around them, her breathing slowed with weariness, and the heavy grip of fear had loosened a little. As she drifted into uneasy sleep, Jack remained awake beside the fire. He studied the storm pressing against the window, but his thoughts lingered on the woman wrapped in his blankets. He could see the weight of burdens she carried even in her sleep, the lines of duty across her face. For years he had lived alone, his only conversations with the wilderness itself. Yet now, inside his small hut, was a queen who had once been surrounded with guards, music, and men who bowed to her name. She was here because she had no choice, and she feared him because she had been told to. Jack set another log onto the fire and leaned back against the wall. Beyond the storm's song, he could hear her faint breathing. In that moment, the hut felt different. Not just a place of survival, but something more. Something that might change both of their lives before the snow melted. The storm did not clear the next day. Jack woke early, pushing aside the thin blanket and steadying the fire before it died. The air inside the hut was sharp and cold, and his breath made small clouds that rose into the dim space. He glanced at Alina, who still lay curled near the hearth, her fine clothes hidden under the heavy furs. She stirred but did not wake, her face easier than the night before. He was surprised by how relieved he felt just watching her rest. He stepped outside for a short moment to check on his snares. The snow was piled deep, and the cold cut at his skin as if it were a knife. By luck, he found one rabbit caught, its body stiff with frost. It was not much, but it was food. Jack was grateful and hurried back to the hut with the kill clutched close to his chest. When he entered, Alina was awake, sitting upright, her wide eyes fixed on him. Her fear flashed again for a moment as she saw the small animal in his hand, but then she realized his purpose. She stayed quiet as he cleaned it with practiced skill and set it to cook over the fire. The hut filled slowly with the smell of meat. For Jack, it was familiar, the food of hard living. For her, perhaps, it was a return at least to strength after a brush with death. He offered her the first portion, holding it out with steady patience. She looked down at the food, then up at him, and finally took it carefully. She chewed with small bites, silent at first, but hunger drove her to eat more. Jack smiled faintly, though he tried not to show it too clearly. Something about seeing her eat gave him a strange comfort, as though the storm outside had lost some of its strength. As the hours passed, the storm kept them trapped. Snow hissed against the window all day, but inside, the fire glowed strong. They began to speak more softly at first, both careful. Alina asked about the forest, about the winters, and about the quiet life he had chosen. Jack told her stories about chasing deer across the frozen hills, building the hut by hand, and learning to read the turning of the weather. His voice was steady, simple, and honest. Then she began to share her own story again, not in the proud way of a queen speaking to her court, but in the quiet tone of a weary woman. She spoke of halls filled with gold light, endless meetings that bound her to duty, and the weight of every decision balanced on her shoulders. She confessed that sometimes she felt less like a woman and more like a symbol carved into stone. Everyone looked at her crown, but not at her face. Jack listened without judgment. To him, her world was so far away it seemed almost like a dream. A palace, guards, silks, and speeches meant nothing beside the simple reality of hunting for supper. Yet even he could understand her loneliness. For though they came from different places, loneliness was something both of them knew. The longer they talked, the less her gaze was filled with fear, and the more it softened with curiosity. At one point she asked why he had not spoken of his family. Jack looked at the fire for a long time before answering. He told her that once he had trusted men who betrayed him and left him broken. Since then he had lived away from crowds, building a life with only the forest as his companion. Her lips pressed tight at his answer, and she whispered that not all betrayal lived in palaces, but she knew the taste of it too. At that moment, a kind of bridge formed between them, thin but unmistakable. Neither of them said anything more for a while, but the silence was not an enemy anymore. When the night closed in again, Jack took his place near the door, while she rested closer to the fire. He stayed awake, sharpening his knife slowly, more by habit than by need. The wind still howled, but inside the hut, he no longer felt as entirely alone as before. Alina watched him for some time before her eyes closed. He did not notice at first, but when he finally glanced over, she was asleep. This time her face was not tense with fear, but calm, as if warmth and safety had finally taken root in her. Jack leaned back against the wall and let out a long breath. He understood that the storm outside had bound them together in ways no palace hall or village street ever could. Neither of them had chosen this meeting, yet here they were, tied by chance, tied by wind, and tied by the silence that still lingered like snow. He wondered if, when the storm ended, she would walk away without a word and vanish back into her world. The thought stung, though he would not admit it aloud. For now, he kept the fire alive, holding on to the fragile balance of warmth and trust growing between them. The storm began to ease by the third morning. The wind was softer, the sky outside brighter, though heavy snow still covered the land. Jack opened the hut door and stepped into the frozen silence. The world was white and still, but he could at last see the shapes of distant trees beyond the ridge, as the worst had passed. When he returned to the warmth inside, he found Alina awake and sitting near the fire. Her eyes followed him with a look that was different now, lighter than the fear she had carried before. For a brief moment, Jack allowed himself to feel at peace. But peace is a fragile thing, and the sound that reached them soon after changed everything. From beyond the ridge came the distant clatter of hooves. Horses pounded across the snowy ground. Shouts broke the silence. Jack stiffened, his hand sliding to the knife at his belt. Lena rose quickly, her face both relieved and conflicted. She whispered that her people had found her. Moments later, the hut door burst open, and armed men rushed inside. Snow swirled in with them as they surrounded the small space, blades shining and eyes hard. Their gazes fixed on Jack as if he were a wild beast cornering their queen. Jack stood calm but tense. He stayed by the hearth, hand near the knife, but not raising it. The guards shouted, accusing him of stealing their queen, of holding her captive in the hut. Their words were sharp and filled with disgust for the lone frontier man. Alina tried to step forward, but the guards urged her back behind them. They told her to move away from him, warning that he was dangerous. Jack did not move an inch, his eyes steady, only the fire crackling between him and their drawn blades. At last, Alina lifted her voice above the storm's fading wind and the shouting inside the hut. She cried out that they were wrong, that Jack had saved her life when the snow would have claimed her. She declared he had offered kindness when death was the only other path. The guards faltered. Their swords remained raised, but doubt passed across their faces. Jack stayed quiet. He did not need to defend himself with words. Her voice carried more strength than anything he could speak. Shh. One of the guards asked her directly if she had been harmed. She stood tall, despite the exhaustion in her body, and answered firmly that she had not been harmed, not even touched against her will. She said again that he had saved her. Her words struck the room like a hammer. The guards lowered their weapons, though their eyes still studied Jack with suspicion. They muttered that he had only been lucky this time, that men of the wild could not be trusted for long. Jack let the insult pass without reply. His life had taught him that words of scorn mattered little. He simply watched as Alina moved closer to him and placed her hand lightly on the fur blanket she had been covered with in her first night of safety. She told the guards that she owed him her life, and they would not speak against him in her presence. The men grew silent at her command, though they still glared at Jack. They knew their place when their queen spoke so strongly. They had no choice but to accept her order. Alina turned to Jack then. Her voice softened, low enough that only he could hear. She thanked him for saving her, for giving her shelter, for treating her with dignity, though he could have turned her away. Her eyes shone, full of meaning he did not fully understand. The guards moved to hurry her outside, eager to lead her back to the safety of her caravan. Jack did not stop them. He watched quietly as Alina stepped to the doorway and looked back at him for one last moment. The snow swirled around her, but her gaze was steady, warm, and full of a strange sorrow. Then she was gone, swallowed by her people and the white horizon beyond. The hut felt emptier than ever before. Jack returned to his spot near the fire, the silence like a weight across his chest. The storm had carried her to him and then taken her away again. He told himself he should feel nothing, that loneliness had always been his companion. But for the first time, the hut felt different. It still had its fire, its furs, and its walls, but none of that filled the quiet as it once had. Now the silence reminded him of a queen who had feared him, then trusted him, and finally defended him against her own. And though she was gone, her voice echoed there in the shadows of the hut, steady and unshaken, the one proof he carried that even in the wildest of storms, compassion could bridge to worlds. The hut grew silent again after Alina and her guards left. The fire still burned, but its light felt colder without her presence. Jack sat staring at the flames until his eyes blurred. For years the wilderness had been his only home, and silence had been his shield. Yet now that same silence pressed on him heavier than the storm had ever done. He realized that something in him had changed, and that he would never look at the small hut or the frozen valley in the same way again. He tried to continue with his life. He checked his traps, cut firewood, boiled water, and hunted when the weather allowed. The days stretched on, but the work no longer gave him peace. With each passing hour, he recalled her voice by the fire, her laugh that had slipped through in brief moments, and her eyes when she defended him in front of her men. He told himself she belonged to another world, a world of crowns and courts that could never touch his. But the memory of her face stayed with him like the glow of the fading fire. One evening when the sun stretched red over the snowy hills, Jack stepped outside and looked at the mountains beyond. They stood tall, shining with ice, but beyond them lay her world. Somewhere in those distant halls, she returned to her life of duty. He wondered if she remembered him even for a moment, as he remembered her every day. Seasons began to shift. Snow melted from the trees, streams broke free from their frozen cages, and the valley changed its color from white to green. Jack tended to his small garden outside the hut and watched deer return to the forest. The world seemed alive again, yet inside he felt the same hollow silence. The storm had left him with more than memories of cold nights. It had given him a glimpse of connection, then taken it away. Late in spring, as Jack prepared his snares near the ridge, a sound carried across the valley. At first he thought it was only the cry of wind, but then hooves struck the ground, and a group of riders appeared through the trees. His pulse quickened as he saw a familiar face among them. Helena rode at the front, her cloak flowing as the horse moved gracefully across the clearing. The guards followed close behind, wary eyes scanning the forest, but she did not look at them. She looked only at him. Jack froze, uncertain if she was real or only some trick of the sunlight. But then she smiled, and he knew.
Ow!
She dismounted quickly, her steps sinking lightly into the soft earth. The guards tried to stay at her side, but she raised her hand and they lingered behind. She walked toward him with calm purpose. At last, she stood before him in the quiet of the valley, away from the eyes of her men. She told him she had not forgotten. Through the nights and the endless halls of duty, her thoughts had returned to the hut, the small fire, and the man who had sheltered her when the storm was at its cruelest. She said that when she defended him, she had spoken to save him, but she found that she had also spoken the truth of her own heart. Jack listened, not trusting himself to speak at once. For months he had thought of nothing but her, yet he had never expected to see her again. At last, he told her he had lived quietly as always, but the silence had been different, harder. Her presence, even for those few days, had changed the rhythm of his world. The words hung between them like fragile glass. Then she stepped closer and reached for his hand. Her touch was steady, her eyes clear. She did not come with promises of fairy tales or escape from duty, but with something simpler and stronger. She came with honesty. Jack closed his hand around hers, not with the force of possession, but with the steadiness of truth. In that moment he did not see a crown or a queen. He saw only the woman he had carried from the snow, the woman who had feared him, then trusted him, then defended him. She had returned, not because of power or command, but because of choice. Their words after that were few. She stayed only a little while, for duty still called her back to her people. But the bond they shared could not be erased by distance. When she rode away again, Jack no longer felt the same hollow silence. His hut was still small, his life still plain, but now it held a memory that warmed him more than fire ever could. He knew their paths might cross again, or perhaps never, but it did not matter. The storm had brought her into his world, and in those days together, they had both seen the truth. Compassion and humanity were stronger than fear, and even a queen and a loner of the wilderness could find a bond worth carrying forever. Jack turned back toward his hut with a rare smile. The silence followed him inside, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with her voice, her kindness, the promise that no storm, no crown, and no distance could erase the mark they had left on each other's hearts.